what's the point? What's the point of marriage? Because at times it's very challenging. And I can remember us having this conversation a couple of years ago. And the point is that nobody does a better job of mirroring to you than in my case, than my wife, showing me how I'm showing up.
Welcome to the Masterful Man podcast. I'm your host, Sven Masterson, coach, mentor, author, and fellow traveler on the path to mastery. Every man reaches a point where he knows he can't keep living the way he has been. The question is, what comes next? Here, you'll hear from men who've made the shift, men who've gone from stuck to unstuck, unshakable, and unstoppable. If you're ready to start moving forward, you're in the right place. In today's episode, I'm joined once again by Craig, a devoted husband and father who's walked through the fire of emotional disconnection in marriage and come out the other side with wisdom, clarity, and a deeper understanding of love. Together, we'll dive into a raw, unscripted conversation about the evolution of love, from performance and conditionality to presence, warmth, and unconditional high regard. If you've ever felt like the more you gave, the colder things become, or wondered why being loving toward everyone else is easier than with the person you married, this conversation is going to strike a chord. Let's get into it. Hey, Craig, welcome back to the Masterful Man podcast. I'm glad you could join. You reached out to me and said, hey, I think we should talk about love. And in my typical fashion, which is ready, aim, fire, ready, fire, aim, I should say.
Yeah.
I said yes, but without really any idea of what we're talking about. So I'm coming into this mostly blind, knowing that we're going to talk about love, but I have no idea where this is going to go. So why don't you tell me what inspired you to reach out about having an unscripted conversation about the topic of love?
Well, first of all, I like the unscripted conversations and sort of spitballing this topic, but the impetus to this conversation is a little bit twofold. So we started reading this book called Love 2.0 by Barbara Fredrickson about a month ago, and I've had it for maybe 6 months. It was recommended to me by another coach, and so I just finally got around to reading it, and it really sort of opened up some different, although the same message, but you read it in a different way, and it hits you, or you're just in a place to receive it differently. This book, I would just say, is sort of reframing what our typical narrative around love is. And so I thought it would be good to just sort of talk through those things and what is the typical narrative of love. And we have talked about in the past how love is maybe overused, or that the word gets overused, and that maybe other cultures even, like, they have different words for love, whether you love your kids or love your parents, love your spouse, love pizza, love your dog, love chocolate, like whatever. It's like, and so what I want to lead with is to challenge the idea that that word is overused, and that perhaps we don't use the right words to describe our relationship with our kids, with our spouse, with our parents, and that love is actually appropriate for these other sort of more daily typical experiences that we have in life, and that there are other virtues that we experience for things with our children and with our spouses and with our parents.
Yeah, this actually might have some. At first, I was like, I felt a little hesitancy for like 10 seconds there. But then I started to think, well, I don't I like to tell my youngest I love them. We exchange that all the time. But it's always felt like a shallow thing to say people I have a deeper relationship with, like Zelda. I still use that term, but I do feel like the word love is way too vague to describe the deepest relationships. Maybe that's what you're saying. That's what I think I hear you're saying, and that's why when we started community, why I chose to use unconditional high regard, which itself is a term, but I felt like it was a more descriptive thing to say than I love flan, for example. My family teases me about this all the time. My new love is halva, which is like a sesame-based Middle Eastern dessert, super yummy. So it doesn't feel appropriate to me to say to my daughters or my sons or my wife sometimes that I love you. And to me, even words, I'm not even entirely sure that words are the best way to communicate that. The older I get, I find myself really becoming more of a love as a verb kind of guy, with really just choosing what kind of space I'm creating for the people that I regard the highly, the kind of energy, the kind of like a intention. So yeah, tell me more.
So it's this idea that we're conflating love with other virtues. And so it's hard to put a name to the challenges of marriage and working through that. Is that really, really love? Or is it a deep sense of dedication to my wife, resilience to making it work,
Yeah,
loyalty to her? It
I
isn't,
like the word devotion there a little bit better than
yeah.
loyalty. But yeah, no, I agree. I think the more there's a concept that we use a lot in our community, and I think we both use in life, which is the more accurate your words, the more accurate your thoughts. And the more accurate your thoughts, generally, the more clarity you'll have as a human being and as a man about what you value. So if I just say I love my wife, well, yeah, what does that mean when things are really hard and you're choosing a set of actions, behaviors, or attitudes to walk through a difficult season? To me, it's more appropriate to say, this is devotion. I'm devoted to my wife. Other times it might be warmth. It might be compassion, kindness. It could be present. You see what I mean?
Yeah, well, I wrote all of those things down because in the book, Love 2.0, it talks about love, sort of redefining it as positivity resonance. So it's like if you describe, like, oh, I really love that person, I really love being around them. Like, we don't we're not describing a person that is cold, like the opposite of those, somebody that's cold, reserved, prickly. That's not a person that we love being around because it's absent of that warmth, um and happiness and joyfulness and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
empathy and all of. So as I've thought about this, and this book describes, is like you have this opportunity to really express and receive love throughout your day with everybody. And what happens is that we, through our upbringing, programming, and society, and we tend to reserve this idea that love is for that one special person in our life, and that's where I'm going to reserve those, that way of being for that person. And then when things get hard, you shut that down and you stop because it becomes this transactional thing where, well, I'm not going to be loving if I think that that person doesn't want to receive it. And so it creates a scenario where that that then is inauthentic and it's not an expression anymore. It's like, well, you're not being loving to be that way because that's who you are as a person. It's as though you think that you're going to get something in return for that. if that's your one special person, it's like this box that gets put in this other place, but then you could go out and be all of those things: joyful, cheerful, happy, empathetic, compassionate, warm to a total stranger, which you could argue like, well, those are these loving virtues. How can you be that to this perfect stranger, yet then this person that you claim to love, you have relinquished that way of being? So why? I think it's because we get stuck in this idea. What I thought was loving was like, look at all this sacrifice. Like, love is not sacrificial. And you could make an argument in many ways that you could express love through doing or through something sacrificial. But for the most part, everyday interactions with people, love is not a sacrificial thing. It is a gift that you give to others and those you're around without any expectation of anything in return, because it's just who you want to be as a person. And I think that gets lost, and it has been lost. And we don't talk about love in this way.
I'm thinking about your love is sacrificial. I would maybe challenge that a little bit, or at least clarify it and say there are times that I'm not going to use love here because, again, my preference is to be more specific than that word. Let me use devotion. Okay, so devotion to a person, I think, will inevitably lead you to sacrifice something, because all relationships are voluntarily include a level of voluntary constraint. That's their nature. A relationship is an agreement to do something mutual that will lead you to have mutual benefit, but also has mutual cost, and cost is constraint, right? So if I am loving somebody, for example, or let's say I'm devoted to my wife, Zelda, okay? Let's say Zelda has um, a huge health challenge, and that health challenge requires a lot of time, attention, energy, focus, and resources. The natural side effect of that as a person is that my devotion is going to lead me to sacrifice how I would otherwise use that time, energy, focus, and resources. So that's how I read the idea of sacrifice anyway. Maybe you're saying something different. But if I
I
go to
think
the
you
groceries,
might I think you might have misheard me. Because I was saying love is not sacrificial, and my point was to delineate between love being separate from devotion. Devotion
well,
better describes
yeah,
that.
yeah, I think I understand. That this is again why, like, the problem is that we have the word overloaded, that we use it for too many things. That's a language is already limited, as people often say, like it's already limiting the nuance of advanced concepts. Like language by its nature is limited,
Yeah.
right? Which
Well,
is
I
why we have to
think
keep making up words.
it got overloaded though in almost being hijacked to be used for the relationship that you have with your spouse. Like in our context, where
Could be, yeah.
if we're then thinking about love or how we want to be loving, and we're only thinking about it in that way, and then it becomes this thing that we feel as though we're unable to be that if it's not being received by that person. The overall point that I'm trying to make is that love is just a way of being. Like, it's a default state that sort of got muddled up by being attached to some of these other things that are just as important, like devotion. But in a marriage, devotion is perhaps the most important thing. You have to be able to look past short-term challenges and operate under that, where just being a loving person is maybe not enough to get you through those types of things. But it's also, if you stop being loving, where you're sort of bringing that essence of love to all of your relationships with people, then particularly your marriage is going to have more challenges, because you're going to look at it and be like, well, why am I not receiving this warm, loving, caring, joyful, happy person? And I see them sharing that and being that way, out with other people. It just, the reason that I wanted to have this conversation is to just try to walk through this and sort of sort through these thoughts, and I'm hoping that there's some clarity that comes out of it.
I hope so too, because I'm admittedly a little bit confused. And that's not something I'm pointing fingers at here. And one of the reasons I think I'm confused is it just may be where I am in life. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm getting less and less focused on words and labels, because it's so taxing as a human to find out, well, what are your definitions for things and how are they different than mine? And so when I'm communicating with somebody else, it's like you have to say, hey, hand me your dictionary, thesaurus, and encyclopedia so I can understand you. And because if we're really words oriented, sometimes we're too cerebral, and I find that the space of our head instead of our heart. So for me, what I like to do is just say, who do I like to be? It's really that simple. Or maybe who do I love to be? Who do I enjoy being? It doesn't really matter. But my internal dialogue is, what feels like the best way to express my authentic self? And my own internal rules for that are that in that context, I'm talking about expressing myself in ways that I do not allow external circumstances to influence. I have a personal nut, which is I'm not a person that adjusts internal values based on external circumstances, because to me, that's to give away power, right? So I don't want your behavior towards me to dictate how I show up in the world, because the moment I do that, I don't own myself. Follow me? Right?
Yeah.
So for me, and you might remember this coaching exercise from the retreat we did in North Carolina, I like to just list out everything about how I enjoy being in the world. And then I like to parse that out. Okay, what of these things is conditional? Because some things are naturally conditional, and they should be, right? Like, I don't believe, for example, that intimacy should be offered to every human being on earth, because some people are not responsible with that. And when I'm saying intimacy, I mean vulnerability, relational intimacy, not necessarily sexual intimacy. So in all of the things I love to do and be, some of them I have conditions for. And that's kind of how you figure out your value system, right? And then some of them I don't, meaning the only condition is my will. So when I go to the grocery store, my value system, I'm going to be warm and pleasant and curious and compassionate to the checkout person. And it's not going to be based on their behavior, because those are things I enjoy being. And I don't want anybody's behavior towards me to control that. Follow?
Yeah.
So I don't walk up to that same person and tell them I love them, just because that's not the way I happen to use the word love. And I'm more focused on how I'm carrying my internal space than necessarily the words I use. It's a choice when I walk up to that person to say, whoa, that's another human being. And in my worldview, every human being is a living, breathing part of the creator. And so to diss another person is to diss the creation. And I try to have the same attitude actually towards all of creation. I try not to be flippant about anything, from animals, how I interact with nature. Like, to me, stewarding our environment is to treat it all with respect and dignity, whether it's a person, an animal, a landscape. It's understanding, hey, all of this is a gift to be around. I might not always enjoy it, but that's a different matter. So how does that fit in with what you're saying?
Well, I remember doing that exercise, and I think that that's kind of what you had said when we were doing that exercise in North Carolina, is that oftentimes with our spouses in the category of how we like to be, where you're that way with um, the cashier or a barista or a stranger you bump into or whatever. You're are the way that you like to be. That let's say this warm and kind individual. Then you take that away in interactions with your spouse, who is the person that
Yeah.
supposedly we love the most, and we throw this word around, maybe in our greatest trials in marriage is, but I love you, or you're supposed to love me, and yet we don't show up with that most basic of human
Yeah.
decency that we have towards others, like that are just these sort of like anecdotal parts of our life. And then we
Yeah.
take that away from that person that we really are supposed to be loving, quote unquote, to. And that's where, like, I think that just we lose that. And the key, I think, is to actually have that lower level of love that you share with the everyday person, is to be able to maintain that with that person that should have the highest level of the word love, which maybe
Yeah.
in this context we're saying is devotion. I think that we lose that ability. It becomes conditional, like, oh well, you didn't do this. It's no longer, it's not a gift like that we, the way that we show up for the cashier, the barista, the stranger. It's a gift in how we like to be. We're not expecting anything in return. Yet for our spouse, and I say all this because this is how I operated, it became like this expectation that, oh well, if I'm going to show up this way, then I expect you to be a certain way back to me, rather than, hey, this is just the way that I like to show up to everybody. And when you stop that low level of love, or what the word love means for your spouse, that's where I think things go off the rails.
Yeah. That is the concept of unconditional high regard, what I mean by it. So the way I say this as simply as I can to maybe a new person I'm working with is that we have the wrong ratio of unconditional high regard and conditional partnership. So every relationship that's healthy has, think of it like a pyramid. You have some sort of base of what you're talking about, which is the regard you give other people that has nothing to do with their behavior, but who you love to be. That's what I would call unconditional high regard, or UHR. You have, on top of that sits your conditions for relationship. And then let's just keep it simple for now, right? So when men's relationship goes sideways, what you typically find is they have made a lot of things conditional that are really best to be unconditional. And they've made a lot of things unconditional, which are really best to be made conditional. So men tend to have unconditional partnerships, but conditional love. So that's a high transaction commercial relationship. It's all trade. There's
Mm,
nothing that's offered a spouse that's just because that's who you love to be. But then they have unconditional partnerships. So they have poor boundaries. They tolerate people and circumstances in their lives that are just completely nuts and oftentimes toxic. But that's because this gets a little bit deeper than maybe you wanted to go. But our regard for other people is always going to mirror our regard for self. So if I have a conditional regard for myself, then let's talk about warmth, devotion, compassion, kindness, empathy, warmth. If those things, if I give myself those things conditionally, I'm absolutely going to give them to you conditionally, because you can't create in the outside world with any kind of impact what is not true in your inside world. So that's why the first thing we really take men through is, let's repair your relationship with yourself, because how you treat your spouse is a reflection of how you treat yourself. If your internal dialogue is shaming, judging, critiquing, condemning yourself, that's just going to be what you do with your spouse, because They're like a mirror for your internal world, right? Um, and so as men improve their internal landscape in that way, and well, you know this because this has happened in your life. The natural consequence is that starts to come out of you. You start to look at the people around you with the same lens you're looking at you. So when you start working through your shame, your insecurities, your how you feel about yourself, and your self-worth improves, and it's based on unconditional regard. The rational mind says, well, if my value and worth is unconditional simply because I'm a human being, in this case made in the creator's image, well, then that has to be true for everybody, including my wife. And so that's what starts to restore relationally some of the warmth, because if I've always made my relationship with my wife conditional, like warmth and compassion, well, now I'm just giving her those things, and it's not because of her behavior, and that creates emotional safety. That's it. That's the side effect, right? Because now she doesn't have to have perfect behavior in order to receive what we all long for as humans, which is people's compassion, their kindness, their empathy, their warmth, right? So we all have to get really clear on those distinctions within ourselves. We have to do the work of repairing your relationship with yourself and figure out, okay, what about my relationship with myself is unconditional? Because you really need some unconditional things in your relationship with yourself. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean that sort of came to pass for me to just be that way. I was talking about this, but this podcast I listened to, and this guy was talking about, well, what's the meaning of life, and the most simple meaning of life is to give more than you receive. And if you just operate in life in that way, not looking to get, and just looking to, like, how can I show up today and give, and but that you cannot give what you don't already have. So you have to make sure that you're sort of grounded yourself and secure in order to show up every day and give that loving warmth and kindness. And I guess for a while that was just, yeah, that was internally lost. And so what I was doing, and I think that a lot of people get into this trap, is that they're looking for that from their spouse. And the society for years is telling us that's where that is. It's in that other person. You have to get it from them. Like, oh, I can't show up on a daily basis as this warm and loving and kind person until they do. It just kind of clicks, I think, one day. At least that's how I say one day, but it was a lot of work to
Over
get to this.
36 months. Yeah.
Yeah, to get to this place of this, but the simplicity of it is really, like, that is what I'm after to talk about in this discussion, is the simplicity of this word love, that and how we show up, and how we give to other people in the world, and not to hold that back from the people that we claim to love the most, where oftentimes we treat them the worst, with the opposite of what those basic warm and loving kind way of being is. So then how could you say, well, I love you? And yes, the word gets conflated, and it can be used in many ways, and I guess that's really kind of more the point of talking about this, because the other piece of this is that to fill in what love means is for me, was to do. If I it was no longer a way of being for me. I wasn't being a loving individual. I got to this point where I was like, well, what can I do to show my love? But it wasn't.
That kind of demonstrated my point I made earlier. That was reflecting your internal recipe for self-love.
Yes.
You had a doing and performance-based system of self-worth.
Yeah, and I think
Most people do.
Yeah, they do. And I was going to say, I think I even see that in many people. Like, I think that it's in the men, it's in the women, where look at all that I'm doing. And it's less about, well, how am I being when I show up in the world? And that's exactly how I was. I wasn't being a loving, warm, kind, open-hearted man. Yet I was pointing at, well, look at all of this stuff that I'm doing. Look at these performance-based things. And if you look at like the most simple thing, my kids, I think that I'm loving and I show up in a loving manner to them every day. That's if I could be that way with everybody, then most of my relationships would be really great. And so I was thinking about like what will my children remember? Are my children going to remember all the times that I mowed the lawn, or the days that I went to work, or the money that I made, or the the trips that I paid for, right? Like they're going to remember the trips, but they're going to remember how we were being on those trips, the experiences they had. But they're not going to remember like dad worked hard to pay for these things. Like
Right.
none
Yeah.
of that doing is something that they pay any attention to whatsoever. It's what they pay attention to is how am I being with them? How am I showing up with them? And that was kind of like the core thought for me is man, if I could show up the way that I show up for my kids, for my wife, I feel like that would be a pretty monumental shift
Yeah.
in my overall energy. And if I stop pointing at or thinking about, well, look at me and all that I do. Okay, well, you can express love through doing, again, but it doesn't come with any condition on the end of it. It's just the way in which you want to be.
It runs out. One of the things I've really been pondering a lot in the last 6 months is just realizing, even in your statement, like the point of life is to love others, to serve others, or to give more than you get. I would say that that's the point of how hopefully we conclude life. But you have to go on a journey to make that possible. And so in our own relationship with ourselves, in our relationship with our partner, there's seasons. And so I like to talk about this idea of the first marriage and the second marriage. I mean, to the same person, but when you start out in life and you choose a partner, in your own emotional and spiritual immaturity, you have this conditional way of loving yourself. And so that's how you love your partner. But then because you're in a partnership, the partnership breaks because you can't go indefinitely in transactional love without somebody going bankrupt. So I think most people treat their marriage when they start ultimately like an escrow account where each person's making deposits and each person is tracking, well, am I making more deposits than you? So like the nature of most of your arguments are, hey, I'm putting all this in, right? And that's where you kind of rattle off all of these sacrifices and efforts and doing based things, because that's how you love yourself, right? Achievement, success, accomplishment, whatever, right? And so because you love yourself that way, you have an escrow account of self-worth, then you love your partner that way. But your partner, like you, is looking really to be unconditionally accepted, to be held, to be witnessed, to receive warmth and compassion and kindness and curiosity and all sorts of things, even in your low times. And so that system breaks. And then you go on a journey, which is painful. And it's the painful journey of realizing the bankruptcy in that for going forward. But you had to learn it. So we all have to learn contrast. We can't really appreciate love until we know the dark. And I'm not saying we go out and do dark things, but you wouldn't know the depth of love if you didn't know the depth of depravity. You wouldn't know the depth of warmth if you didn't know what coldness was. There's just everything in the universe has this kind of contrast. So I've come to see that marriage, which is a place with potential to learn deep intimacy, has a season that you have to go through that has deep disconnection. And if you don't understand that, you end up bailing out of the process that's, if you allow it, will teach you the contrast that gives you the ability to appreciate intimacy. And it'll teach you, hey, here's what a superior way of love looks like that you wouldn't be able to appreciate if you didn't try this other system first of the escrow account, the conditional love. And so in the process of going through that, from switching over from conditional regard to unconditional regard, switching from an escrow based account to what I would say is an inheritance, which is I don't need to make deposits to this account. It's infinite. And I can withdraw from it anytime I want because it's my birthright to do so. And I can share it with you. And I would say this is the kind of love you have for your children. And this is a huge gift of parenting right in the middle of this thing we call marriage because it's disruptive to our worldview, which is transactional before this, right? So when you get kids or for some people, pets, and you have this thing in your life, you start to find this new thing inside of your heart that has regard for this living being that's not based on their treatment of you. You just love them or you disregard them or whatever word we're using. That's a beautiful thing. It's a really beautiful thing. And I think it starts to poke at these places in us that maybe are asking questions about what is love? Like, what am I here for? And it starts to erode this part of us that believes our value and worth and therefore our connection and our intimacy come from performance and achievement because that's a bankrupt gig. We've talked about this a lot, right? You and I. If you have to earn your worth and your value, I'm going to be crass here. Good fucking luck. Because you have to be better than 105 billion people to know that you've done a good job. It's the only way, right? Like, because as soon as you think you've reached some sort of milestone of achievement, the moment you notice that somebody else has achieved more and you compare yourselves to them, you feel like a turd. And you're right back to like, because your worth and your value, your sense of self comes from that, you're crestfallen. And so, you know, you're riding the wave of like an emotional S&P 500, as I like to say to some men. And so you're just constantly good days, bad days, good days, bad days, because how your circumstances are it's like completely dictating how you feel about yourself and then the world. And marriage is the great disruptor. Marriage and loving something unconditionally, like a children or a pet.
Well, and it is, and this question has come up many times in the community. What's the point? What's the point of marriage? Because it's at times it's very challenging. And I can remember us having this conversation a couple of years ago. And the point is that nobody does a better job of mirroring to you than your, you know, in my case, than my wife, showing me how I'm showing up. And I just posted about this, but like it's almost like an exponential response. If I'm showing up cold, reserved, arguably not loving towards her, which I would say I wasn't. I might have been doing many things that from the outside people could say, oh, like, look at all that. Look at all that he's doing. He must really love her. But if my internal feelings were of, well, I'm not getting what I want out of this, then really I'm not and wasn't showing up as a loving man. Not warm, you know, cold, reserved, stoic in the bad way. And so
there's no bad way to be stoic. That's a misappropriation of the word stoic.
Well,
I'm just ball busting you a little bit because people use stoic to describe a state that stoics actually wouldn't have embraced. But keep going.
Yes. So that's like the modern day, or like that guy's stoic, like he shows no emotion, is like a rock. That's what I mean by that. It's just
I know what you meant. It just pisses me off when people misappropriate.
No, it is funny because you're like, yeah, the Stoics weren't like that even a little bit. But so if you bring that to the table in your marriage, you're like, hey, this is how I'm going to be towards you. Well, initially, I think that this was how my wife was, tried really hard, tried her best to bring warmth and kindness and compassion and empathy and love and cheerfulness and to like get me out of that funk. I would say that she tried to lead me to a better way of being. And maybe some men figure that out and they don't go down the more difficult road. But for me, I didn't. And then it became this more of a battle of, me just showing up in that way. And then it eroded her feelings of wanting to be that way.
Yeah.
And so then you have both people. And that was probably quite a bit earlier on because the immature reasons for why I showed up in that way were then tied to what reflections of my self-worth that I thought that I had. And so it then becomes this vicious cycle and you almost get lost as to, all right, like, where did this even start? It's the chicken or the egg, and who is showing up that way to begin with to start this cycle, and somebody needs to break it.
You know what I love about this is you basically just you just did an inadvertent commercial for the Unchained Husband book of mine that I'm.
Oh, well, you're welcome.
Maybe you'll be alive by this. You're describing the path to emotional gridlock, emotional relational gridlock. And I think you'll like how I explain it in that book, which I don't want to get into the depths and bowels of that book yet, and not in this podcast. But yeah, this is the situation. And you get married thinking that you're going to have a fairy tale story because we're sold a story that marriage is about your happiness. And I would say that's true on some levels, but I prefer to see that marriage is about my wholeness and wholeness is about my happiness. And I think if you get married thinking marriage is supposed to make me happy, whether you understand that you're doing this or not, you're tacitly saying that marriage is about my spouse making me happy, which is the kind of relationship people have with idols. Because if you don't know how to be happy entering marriage and marriage is supposed to make you happy, marriage isn't a thing, right? You're married to a person. And so anything that you get from marriage that you're not giving to marriage is coming from the other person. You see?
Right.
Right.
Like if someone were to look from the outside at marriage or whatever, you don't get happiness from marriage, but you could give happiness to marriage, right?
100%,
like,
yeah.
If you were being that way, like just imagine a world where everybody just treated everyone else with unconditional high regard, believing the best in them.
I believe that's actually the foundation for a just society myself, and why it's such a big virtue for us in our community. I mean, yes, it helps transform marriages, but people with transformed marriages transform culture. And transform culture does exactly what you're talking about, which probably sounds like idealism for a lot of people who can't appreciate that, but it would transform society.
Because appropriate boundaries, when part of that, is really sort of like a perfect union.
I would say it's impossible to have unconditional high regard for people without perfect boundaries. Because perfect boundaries come from unconditional high regard for yourself. Here's what I mean.
Yeah.
If I truly have unconditional regard for myself, I'm never going to abandon myself in the process of loving another human being, because that would be to step out of unconditional high regard. When I really understand my value and worth, I have natural, easy boundaries, because when faced with a context where I'm in some way being invited to participate in something, I would say, no, I would never do that. That would be to my self-harm. Why would I ever harm myself? And I would just say, no, I'm not going to go along. And I use the example with men who are stuck in emotional gridlock, because when you're in emotional gridlock, you're usually giving each other these tests. Well, if you really love me, you do this, right? And I asked them, well, if your wife said, hey, if you really love me, you'd rob this bank, you're not going to do it, most men, right? Because you recognize, no, that's not in my value system. Or if you really love me, you'd kill my neighbor who bugs the shit out of me, right? You're not going to do that because that's a clear boundary for you. So when they come up with other tests, why is that any different?
Well, people forego their boundaries, or they never. It's a part of this emotional adolescence where I don't know that boundaries are fully formed, or values are not fully formed by the time you're injected into this dependent relationship
Yeah,
that
you're right.
you
Yeah.
believe that your values are actually tied into, or your worth is
Yeah.
tied into. um
Values and boundaries are an attribute of identity. So if I don't know who I am, I
yeah,
can't know the edges of who I am, and I can't know the description of my values because I'm ambiguous.
but
That's the nature of not knowing.
if you believe who you are is partially, in large part, tied to your partner completing you, the entire thing is off from the start. Like,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
kicks off wrong, and that is what we are taught.
If this was a visual podcast, I'd bring up an illustration of this. That first half of marriage, well, think about it this way. Before marriage, you're a he, your wife is a she. And you get in this thing called marriage and you set your he and she aside and you become we. And that we becomes so dominant that you lose sight of, like, what is me and what is she? And this is reciprocal. So you start to feel pain and you say, well, she's not doing this or she's doing that. And you believe that your partner is the source of your pain. And she's saying the same thing. I'm feeling unhappy. I'm feeling pain. Well, he's not doing that. And if he would just do this. And it's because the we has become so dominant that you've lost your sense of individuality, which is why the process of breaking through this leads to this thing we call differentiation, which is to get out of enmeshment and back to I'm me, you're you. Right? I'm responsible for me, you're responsible for you. But in your dependency and enmeshment, you created this kind of like thing that you imagine, this we that has absorbed your individual identities. This is why it's really common in what we call midlife crises or this marriage trouble for a man or a woman or both to say, I don't know who I am anymore. I have to go find myself. That's not just being dramatic. That is quite literally what needs to happen. It
Yeah,
doesn't mean
I feel like I did.
That's what we do in our community, right?
No, I know. I mean,
Yeah.
like it very much. I would say that my outlook on many things has changed. Over the course of the last 3 years, where my self identity was still very much a 13 to 20-year-old boy.
I would
And
say, if you allow me to add a color, it was also mingled in with 13 to 20-year-old girl that you're partnered with because of the we thing. She's next to you every day, kind of having a similar experience, and the nature of enmeshment and dependency is you start to feel like you have to carry one another's emotional baggage. I like to say that you become each other's emotional Sherpa, and so you're not just the 13 to 20-year-old boy. Now you're trying to satisfy, as best as you understand it, the pain and suffering of a 13 to 20-year-old girl. And she's doing the same thing. And this is, again, it leads to complete gridlock in the relationship. And this
and
is,
it's
of
nice
course,
to
where
be
I go.
like, if you can say, okay, like, my emotions are my emotions, your emotions are your emotions. Like, that's the goal, is that we get to say, I'm I'm responsible for me, you're responsible for you. However, doing
That's
that,
nuanced, isn't it?
well, right, but like, doing that without both partners being in a stance of unconditional high regard towards one another, that's going to be difficult. And if both don't have it, then I don't know that it works
Sort
at
of.
all. So if one person at least has it and can lead with that, then now there's a fighting chance.
Here's my experience, and I have this conversation about 200 times a year, probably. I think it's highly, highly, highly unlikely that both partners walk in that direction at the same time. And I think actually the reason the divorce rate is 56% is that most modalities try to get both partners to move out of gridlock at the same time. If we had any kind of surgery that had a 56% success rate, we would start looking for other options. If you went to a cardiologist and said, "Hey, I need a bypass," and they said, "Well, yeah, 56% success rate, you're probably going to look for another." But as a society, we keep trying this tired approach of trying to break emotional gridlock by moving two people through a transformation at the same time. I don't believe that works. It's an exception if it does. So what does work, although it's painful, and this would be true in a big traffic jam too, is you move one at a time, right? So one person needs to go from their emotional bondage to emotional freedom. And this is what makes exiting gridlock difficult, is because your dependency and measurement make you want to basically do that as a three-legged race, like where you say, "Oh, I took 2 steps forward, now you take 2 steps forward." But you're breaking that conditional transactional relationship. So you can't use a transactional conditional path to exit that dynamic. That doesn't make any sense. But that's what most people do. I'll grow when you grow. Well, that's the system that's not working for you. The process you've been going through, and I would say the men in our community go through, is, do you get guided across that transformative space yourself? And what makes that difficult is because your partner is not going through it at the same time. You're getting a rather critical, nasty, sometimes cold, uncaring peanut gallery commenting on your transformative journey. And because you're accustomed to measuring your well-being by your spouse, not yourself, it's very confusing. But that's what breaks you from believing that your partner is you and you are your partner. You have to come to this break. It's very much like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. It turns into this gelatinous protein that you're like, I don't see how this could be a butterfly. And it's not. But it's also not a caterpillar. It dies essentially in the cocoon, and it resurrects as something new. And that's what happens with people in that process. But on the other side of that, you emerge as a person, like you went through your own emotional gridlock, Craig, and you resurrect as a new you that has a system of self-worth that's rooted inside instead of outside. It's disconnected from needing her approval. You're emotionally safe. And you're also qualified as a guide, which a guide is not rescuing you. A guide is just telling you the way, to share with your partner, "Hey, honey, I see you struggling with this." And you can encourage them on their own personal journey, because they have to also leave the caterpillar stage and go through the cocoon stage and a butterfly. But if you try to make that conditional on one another's growth, you just stay gridlocked. And that's why people just basically divorce out of it, or have an affair, or stay resentful the next 50 years.
It's funny that you just said that, because we had our 14th anniversary and we were at lunch, and I was like, I was just listening to I listened to a lot of Jack Johnson when I was in college, and I just happened to be listening to, I don't know which album it was, but there was this lyric in one of his songs, and it says, "I don't want to be your regrets, I want to be your cocoon." And I was like, I just have this like ringing in my head, and I told her that, and she's like, "I don't know what that means."
That feels a little gross to me, but okay. If you're listening to this and resonating with the experience of emotional gridlock, where it feels like no matter how hard you try, things just aren't shifting, there's a reason. Most men are trapped in relational patterns they never learn to name, let alone escape. That's why I wrote The Unchained Husband, to help men understand how they get stuck, why their efforts often make things worse, and what it takes to break free. It's not just a book, it's a roadmap to emotional freedom and intimate leadership. You can find The Unchained Husband on Amazon.com or anywhere fine books are sold.
All right, so this Jack Johnson lyric, the meaning of it, in my opinion, I don't want to be your regrets, I want to be your cocoon. Like, maybe you could look at it many different ways, but for me, what that means is, like, if if you reviewed the experiences that we had together in the marriage as all these regretful things, then you'd come out of that no different a person, not having grown, only looking at that in a negative light. But, and maybe even for me, it's that it was this growth stage. It was this thing that I needed to go through, that she needed to go through to become these better versions of ourselves, which is just that working through that adolescent period. And we talk about that in the emotional adolescence. But so Barbara Fredrickson in this book, and I posted this in the community, but that we're so dependent as children on our parents and loved ones, like they're providing these warmth opportunities, these loving opportunities, these experiences of positivity. Even our school systems do that. They inject it into our lives, and as you become older, you're detached from that, and then you're basically, it's like, here you go, you have to figure out how to provide these things for yourself. And I, unfortunately, the messaging is go find that one person, and then they're going to be that person that provides these positivity experiences for your life. And so, I mean, I know a lot of people, and even myself in that like early 20s stage, is if I wasn't finding that person, then I felt like I had no positive experiences in my life. I didn't realize that all of that basically came from within. So her I'm just going to read this because I really think it's great. And it says, adapting to this stark change can be like learning to cook for yourself. After decades of having your every meal prepared by parents and then by dining hall staff, you needed to learn to put the right balance of micronutrients in your plate every day. While the effects getting the balance wrong may not have shown up for months or even years, you felt those effects nonetheless in terms of unhealthy changes in weight or health. Think of love as another key micronutrient. How long will it take before you learn to put the right amount of it in your daily diet? It can take years, even decades, for people to learn this vital life lesson, that in the real world, you are responsible for feeding yourself your own recommended daily value of love. And this basically hit me right between the eyes,
Mm-hmm.
because I had been saying, like, for a while, is my wife's interpretation of like my desire for love from her was sex. That was it. And I kept saying, like, no, it's more than that. It's warmth, it's kindness, it's joy, it's cheerfulness, it's this way in which I want you to show up. And so the last, I don't know exactly what time frame, let's say it was 2 weeks ago. So she basically was showing up in this warm, kind, loving way. And I recognized in myself that I still wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I got exactly what I wanted in this warm and loving being, this wife of mine, the mother of my children, showing up every day, like really just joyful and happy. And yet I was still showing up every day, not. And
Mm-hmm.
that made me really reflect on this. And it just happened to coalesce with reading this passage in this book. And I was like, man, you're responsible for this. Like, it's clearly not in her, because here she's showing up this way, and you're still Mr. Grinch internally. I don't know that she could see, or that my kids could, or anybody, but like I was still feeling that way. And so a big sort of light bulb moment for me is like, well, you seem to be able to show up that way, when you go get your cup of coffee, when you're communicating with customers at work, when you bump into somebody, some acquaintance that like, you have it within you to be that person. Why is it then that you're withholding that basic level of of love or unconditional high regard for this person that you claim that, to be the person that you love in your life. And I just was like, well, yeah, maybe you're the problem. Me, as in, I'm still have some sort of condition that I don't understand, or I just need to start being the person that I want to be at all times, because why not? Um, and it's my
That's
responsibility to be that way.
yeah, that's ownership, which is of course one of the community values. Even unconditional high regard. I mean, a really simple way of saying that is love that you own. When you need somebody else's behavior to be a certain way before you give regard, you don't own those things; they do. So while we had our little commercial break there, I got a chance to think about this cocoon thing a little bit more, and it initially sounded codependent to me, which is why I kind of bristled. But the explanation that hey, I want to be basically or our relationship to reflect a stage where we each experience mutual transformation and you experience your transformation. I think that's actually quite a mature that's a very mature way to see it. So I can appreciate that, and I would say that is what a long-term relationship like marriage does. Is it marriage gives us a context that each have our individual cocoon stage as humans, where we're going from the ground-based caterpillar to the skybound monarch. And I use the monarch specifically for a reason, because it is, I think, when you enter your kingship as a man, your queenhood, if that's even a word, as a woman, like where you experience the best part of yourself, right? The benevolence, the internal wellspring of well-being. And you can't get there without death, like this cocoon death thing. And marriage gives you a context to live that out, in a way. But one of the things you brought up, it's kind of a stirring topic for me, is I feel like right now in culture that there's widespread messaging that seeks to keep people perpetually caterpillars. We learn, like, we're indoctrinated to this idea of dependency-based love. In fact, it's even a lot of mental health messages, interestingly, especially one popular on social media. They actually just promote enmeshment, codependency, and systems that will ultimately lead to gridlock. Now, I don't know if that's intentional or if that's that it's just a bunch of people who haven't been through this stage in a personal or relationship level. But I find it challenging because some of these people have millions of followers, and the message they promote is ultimately one that will lead you to relational bankruptcy, because it requires that people basically keep serving you the meal plan, to go back to your metaphor from Love 2.0. You must learn to feed yourself emotionally. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And the diet
It's
changes.
Yeah, it's so different than what we're told. And I don't know if it was on the recording or before we were talking. I think it was before we were talking, and I was saying I'd listened to one of the other podcast episodes, and I got just really frustrated for men and for women that, it takes us, in some cases, some of the men in our community are, in their late 50s or 60s, coming to these realizations that what we have been fed is just not serving us. And yes, I am fortunate that at 37, I hit this wall. I'm fortunate and grateful that my wife, said, this doesn't work. Something is wrong inherently. Um, but it is frustrating to continuously see this sort of messaging be what, my children are learning, which they're, I should say my children's age group, um, because we're teaching them something very different. Um, And I'm sure they're going to go through their own transformation, but hopefully it's not going to be as painful or as long a process
Yeah,
as
yeah.
ours was. But
They'll they'll have an awareness. There's a downside to that too, which my girls would tell you that I've accidentally ruined film and music for them because we have family movie night every Friday, and my 12-year-old would be like, "That's codependency. That's enmeshment." Um,
yeah,
I mean, I think this is terrific, but they also recognize that the stuff that's peddled to them in movies, they also recognize it as a pretty immature way of love, and
mm,
and so they don't like me to always watch movies with them. I really do my best to keep my mouth shut so they can enjoy the movie because otherwise I would be adding this kind of relational commentary sometimes. So I'm proud of them that they recognize this, especially at young ages. Um, and I do think it will prepare them at least to know what's going on and to know that it's a season. And so one thing about all this conversation is just like an adult 40-year-old man wouldn't think that he shouldn't have had his adolescence and childhood years. I think you have to also have that mindset with marriage. You have to let go of the idea that you shouldn't have gone through this first stage, right? Every butterfly starts as a caterpillar, every one of them. So that's not an accident. That's not something to be ashamed about or
no,
to should yourself over. And so I'm not trying to not have my children experience those caterpillar years. I really just want them to understand the bigger story that they're living in so that they understand, hey, when these things happen, it's going to feel like death. It's going to feel really dark. It's going to feel cold. You're going to be taxed in a way, but that's the transformation process starting. And
yeah,
really
but
for me, for my marriage to turn around, I had to first own the process, but I had to be willing to like comply inwardly with that idea. Like I had to have the trust that though this feels like a scary, dark death place, that is the crucible, by the way, of a hero's journey. I had to trust that, hey, I hope I come out on the other side. And when I could start seeing the bigger story, it actually gave me all of the attributes I needed to endure it, and to go through that cocoon stage.
and but they're going to face that with like confidence and tools.
I hope so.
Where,
That's my goal.
well, right, and I think that the 56% divorce rate is because they most largely people don't have those. Now, the tool that I did have and that my wife had was a probably a moral grounding of devotion. um and I think that that's a really, really key, it also devotion to myself,
Mm-hmm.
that um because I it was questioned certainly throughout this process, like, why are you still doing this, why are you in this? And it's like, because I know there's something within me that I need to keep working on. Like, I know it. I remember even 6 months ago with you, I was like, there's something, I'm missing something, like, and it feels really big, but like centimeters away. And I don't know what it is, but I can't like stop this devotion to myself or to her because I can't even identify it. And until I'm able to and like work through that, no, I'm not going to leave this. And I'm sure, and because I know her and all of these wonderful qualities exist, I'm not going to give up on that. And so now what I've seem to have identified, at least in myself, is that I had not realized that I was still seeking this basic level of loving kindness towards other people
Yeah,
from her. And that it
yeah,
wasn't, even though I know inherently that it was within me, to be that way because I was being that way towards other people, but I was withholding it from her. And that's like, okay, you got to figure out why you're doing that, because you're clearly not showing up the way that you would want to on paper. If you were writing out, how do I want to be as a husband, as a man, as like, you're not even showing up the way that you would write yourself out. So
Yeah.
perhaps you need to look at that and change that. And that was a big
This
shift. I think it was an important thing for me to come to an understanding of.
this is a good place to introduce an idea for maybe somebody who's listening who this isn't how their story is going. So I have a couple things to say about. One is I don't think staying married is necessarily superior to divorce, meaning some relationships should end. So even though we're talking about the divorce rate, I do think it's good for culture to have stability in families. Don't mistake what I'm saying. But it's easy for some people to hear a conversation like this and think we're saying that staying married is a superior outcome, and that's not always the case, because at the end of the day, if you have to abandon yourself to have the relationship, I would not call that victory. So what actually at the core of the Masterful Man message is that there's this journey to go through in marriage, and that we find, it's just a perspective, it's not dogma, that before you end your marriage because you don't have a butterfly wife, make sure you're not a caterpillar, right? So this is kind of where, because most men are like ground-based caterpillars complaining that they don't have a butterfly wife, and we understand. We all did this too, and so our message is kind of like, okay, yeah, it's good to want a butterfly wife. Let's make sure that we get you through the cocoon stage to being a butterfly, a monarch, to recover your best self. And you know what? When you're there, you may say the most loving thing I can do for all parties involved is to move on from this relationship. But you'll be making that decision as a butterfly, a monarch, instead of a caterpillar.
Yeah.
And I actually would, this is it's a little bit more complicated in reverse. There's several women I've been talking to, just saying like, do you guys feel like that's true for you too? Like women who feel like, hey, I want a monarch husband, encouraging them to go through their transformation. But what's difficult for women in the reverse of this is a lot of women want to be that monarch version of themselves, but the cocooning process is messy, just like it is for you and I. And every time they try, they run into the reactivity, the insecurity, the defensiveness, the immaturity of the man in their life, and they keep shutting down their own process because they're not in an emotionally safe environment. So our philosophy for the listener is we help a man become emotionally safe, which is to become a monarch. And most of the time, about 85% of the time, in the people we work with, depending on when we meet them, if they do that, they create an environment where, because they're understanding the bigger picture, their spouse will also quite happily go through their own personal transformation. And then on the other side, you get two monarchs, right? And that's a beautiful, intimate marriage, but it's messy as hell to get there.
And requires devotion.
It requires devotion, but I would say I'd reiterate this, you have to be devoted to yourself first. And it's imperative that you do not abandon yourself. The process is for you. It's not to create marriage. Marriage, again, is just a context where we learn to be whole. And so sometimes a marriage can't support that. Sometimes they're too toxic. Sometimes it's like, hey, this is not going to work. Anyway, keep going.
No, yeah. I mean, I think like what we've described, we tend to use the word resilient, like for us as men in this stage. And I would say I would have described myself like as resilient through this process. But there's almost, I don't know. I feel like there's a context of that, oh, you're resilient, and that the things you're enduring from the outside are challenging, and congratulations to you for being so resilient through all of that. Whereas I think a better way that is more internally focused would be, I do really feel like I had a devotion to myself through this, to knowing, like, even if subconscious, that I was not the best version of myself. And so there was a devotion to figure that out. So, hopefully that bears fruit and will bring out the best in in marriage. But I think that it is. It's going that direction. And that feels good. So
Yeah, I think so too. And your wife seems to be pretty excited about our message. And I think by your own report, it's created freedom for you. This kind of idea, right? But again, we don't hold it dogmatically. This is just what works for the men it works for. And usually those men know, like, the stuff we're saying will resonate for them. And if that's them, we've got a pretty well worn path through that transformation process that a lot of men understand, know the twists and turns. And yeah, is it for everybody? I don't know.
Well, I think, sort of, just to wrap up, like, love is a way of being, and it is not conditional. It shouldn't be, because it's how you decide how you want to show up in the world. And
How about we replace shouldn't with it doesn't need to
serve,
be.
yeah. Well, it doesn't serve you. It certainly doesn't serve, your desires. It didn't serve my desires for the type of life that I wanted to have, to be conditional in the love that I provided.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was a way for me, I guess, again, going back to why did I even want to talk about this? I hope somebody on the earlier journey or earlier time in their journey would hear this. And I don't know if I'd heard it 3 years ago that I would have fully understood it. And, maybe I wouldn't have, since North Carolina was 2 years ago and we went through that exercise. But it wasn't this.
It's a process.
Yeah, it is. But it really is very simple on the surface if you think about, like, am I even treating my wife with the basic level of love that I will treat a cashier? And if you're not, I pretty much could guarantee that things are not going to progress in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like what you said earlier about effective for getting what you want. If I had to sort of summarize what the free sessions I have with men reaching out, if I distill down what they all want, it's not that they want sex or more money. They're all ultimately after intimacy. And intimacy meaning to be able to see into another and to be seen in themselves and accepted. What I think this is the human condition. We all want intimacy. We all want something to see deeply in us and accept it without condition. And we also want to have that role in other people's lives. So if that's true, then you really can't do that in this escrow basis, right? Because part of intimacy is I'm going to open up my insides to my partner to see. And they're going to see everything. They're going to see the really beautiful, noble and honorable and respectful things. But they're also going to see my hurts, my shadows, like a bunch of ugly shit, right? And so if you have a conditional regard for somebody, here's what I would suggest. You can't have intimacy, not deep intimacy. because you're teaching yourself and your partner, well, I'm not going to accept some of the things about you. And then, but then you'll feel disappointed that you lack this intimacy. So if you want deep intimacy, it's found by, first of all, going through your own cocooning stage, because that's when you create intimacy with yourself. You can't have intimacy with other people that exceeds your intimacy with yourself. Because if you can't look into you and accept you, explain to me how you could look into somebody else and accept them or allow them to accept you. This was my story anyway. I had to do that first, and that was my cocoon. And, then my wife has gone through her own. But in the monarch stage, what's beautiful is, and what makes it so deeply intimate, is that you have seen your partner in their totality so far. You've seen them at their ugliest and their most beautiful, and you accept all of it, just all of it. And what is meaningful to your partner is that they know that you lived all this and you still said yes. Like, you saw the cold, nasty, unlovely parts, or I'll say for your wife's sake, the cold, bad parts. And you said, all right, I accept you. And she looked at yours and she accepted you. Like, that is a transcendent experience. And that's what makes the intimacy of the latter half of marriage really profound, because you didn't just love each other through happy transactions, which is what you start out marriage doing. I'm going to give you, like that's the expression we say sometimes. It's like a man saying to his fire, I'll give you more wood when you give me more heat. Like, that's never going to work. And that transactional system is anti-intimacy. So for the man listening, if you want an intimate experience, and this is not just true with partners, it's also true in friendships. And it doesn't mean you should always be in every friendship, but the nature of relationships is to have intimacy, you have to go through some ugly places sometimes. I mean, you don't have to, meaning nobody's holding a gun to your head to do it, but the depth of your relationship will only be as deep as the places you're willing to, like, walk through. And, that can be tough. One thing I really like about our community, and this is why I believe, regardless of what community a man is in, men need to be practiced in this. If you don't let your wife see you, you need to learn to be seen. And so the big value, I think, of being in a solid group of men, and they have to be men who are themselves letting themselves be seen, is that you get practice. You get practice seeing one another, and you get practice being seen by one another. And that becomes a muscle memory. It's just like any other thing we do in life. The more you do it, the more you feel confident with it. And so this is why, even in the men I've worked with, it's the men who avail themselves to the brotherhood of other men, this kind of intimate environment, that they're generally the ones that are going to be the most successful in trying to turn around a marriage that feels really stuck. And it's because they're learning to be intimate. The guys that lurk endlessly, and they never let men see them, they don't share themselves, they generally don't.
I would say that probably was what helped me to come to this understanding myself, because if I can't show up with unconditional high regard for, men, because they're
low stakes, no skin in the game, or
right,
no
like,
real, yeah.
How am I going to do that in a high stakes situation? So the practice, even as as a loving brother, for men that are struggling, that maybe at times whose behavior you can right out of the gate see, like, oh geez, that's whatever, maybe not on paper to the way that I think that they want to be showing up, but for me to show up with high regard and understanding and kindness, and more of as a guide in that, is helpful to understand. My kids don't probably show up. I have three daughters. Like I know my middle one yesterday woke up on the wrong side of the bed. And if I withhold my love and warmth from them because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed, like that's not a way I want to be. And yeah, it's good to have this practice. So
That's what made all the difference for me. I spent probably 20 years like on maybe what you'd call personal development, and I still felt really stuck. And it was not until I uncomfortably put myself in the company of other men and got a coach. But and I love my coach, don't get me wrong, but it was really the real force multiplier was the other men. And that is the thing I had been missing. And I wasn't like some isolated survivalist living in a bunker. I was with other people all the time, but I was not with people that were calling me into that standard, and that changed everything for me.
yeah, I don't think I'd be where I'm at. I mean, I did one-on-one, I did coaching, but like the community and the brotherhood and the response, the loving and challenging response that I would get to people to really like guide me into a better way of being, even in this most recent like evolution of self, I don't think that I would have been able to get there. And I like it was a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
to me it's something I'm going to permanently do. And that might sound weird. People are going to be like, yeah, duh, you have a men's community, of course you will. But I actually recently joined a community outside of our community just to have a space where I'm not a leader, where I can keep staying engaged with other men who call me to high standards. And I really am doing the best to just make that always a part of my life. I do that also, of course, professionally. I have lots of communities I'm a part of where I can see and be seen.
yeah,
Uh,
uh,
and I don't see myself not doing that throughout the rest of my life.
I can feel. I think in your position it would be hard to not have that. I mean, I've talked about this a little bit, yeah, but like just getting the title of leader, it's hard. And I think to actually be the leader of the community, like in your spot, is yeah, it's hard to be as open as one would need or want to be. It's almost like going to another town where nobody really knows you, but
Yeah,
they
yeah,
like they love you. You know?
yeah. I have I have an easy time with the openness. I just don't think the community always any community doesn't always have an easy time receiving it,
Yes.
because there's this thing. I think it's called the Olympus effect or something. There's this thing about people where we like our illusions, and so we tend to think or really latch on to the idea that somebody out there is not struggling or not weak. And so one of the reasons I am in another community is because that's kind of an impossible standard to be held to as any kind of leader. And let's even use the example of in marriage, because a lot of times in marriage, most long-term married men will say they've encountered some scenario where they can tell their wife is really disappointed in their humanity, right? And so in this stage of marriage, one of the things we help men with is a place they could be human, because they would generally say, well, I don't feel like I can be real in my marriage because my wife says she wants me to. And then the moment I do, she just can't handle it. Right. Brene Brown talks about the same thing. Women want you to be vulnerable, but they really can't stand seeing you fall off your white horse. Not until a lot of growth has happened. And so in our community, men can fall off the white horse and we don't judge them for it. But that pattern is true, right? So in my life, what's been a struggle at times leading first mentoring men and now masterful men was like a good bit of you in the community members are totally happy for me to be who I am. But some, they're going to be crestfallen.
Yeah.
And
Well, they're the people that can't see their fearless leader fall off the white horse. When I read that in Brene Brown's book, it like actually brought me to tears. Because I felt it so
Mhm.
much, and I was just like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's no place for me to not be on the top of the horse.
Yeah. Yeah. This is
And
really, 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 really hard for a lot of men because they want intimacy. And part of intimacy is, look, here's my shadows, here's my dark places. I'll use a common illustration. And it's probably more common with some religious people, is some women, if they find out a man has struggled with pornography, um, they treat him like he's a monster.
yep,
And then he says he's super confused. He's like, I'm trying to do right by being seen and being honest and being vulnerable and being authentic. But man, that was expensive. And now some of those men, maybe their fathers, their wife doesn't trust them around children. Like it gets just super hard for some of these guys, right? And yeah, I get it. It's the same effect, right? So we all need a place, and sometimes early in marriage, it can't be your marriage where you can let other people see you and accept you. And I think that's what community should do, or exist to do, I should say. And good community does. It doesn't. It can see you and accept you, call you to a higher standard without shaming you for where you are. It doesn't judge you. It doesn't. It doesn't also pacify you. It doesn't say, okay, yeah, you're there. Well, good job, right? We don't have the kind of environment where everybody gets a medal for just being there. And so I think a healthy community can foster all of this stuff, right? Because that community hopefully is built on things like this unconditional high regard we're talking about.
yeah, we've discussed this probably privately, that being naked and unashamed, and I think that that's where the fear there's a fear that prevents the open expression of love. And because if you do that and you're not seen, then you feel it's the judgment that you feel. And
Or
so I think,
rejected. Yeah.
yeah, like, and rejection feels to me like judgment. And so what, and I'm not putting this on my wife. I think this is something that grew over time in many different circumstances. And
And we're absolutely doing this to them, by the way.
oh,
Right. There's
for
yeah.
sure, for
Yeah.
sure. So, but it was something that I came to realize is I became colder. There was, I think that the way that I operated in my marriage was primed for judgment. And in many times it didn't exist. But I was ready for it. And so being ready for it was like, don't be warm. Because if you're warm and then you're judged, well, they got
Mhm.
one over on you. Or you're warm and then they're cold, or they got one over on you. And it's like, well, that shouldn't be, because that's where the insecurity lies. Because if you were just being that way to be that way, but that's super hard to come to that
Well, yeah, you have to heal.
realize.
Like you're
Yeah.
describing, our juvenile selves are very shielded. We put up walls around places we're wounded. So you have to address those wounds in order to show up without those shields up. And and you can't generally address those wounds in marriage. I don't think anyway. I have found that those wounds are addressed with brothers, and I think for women with sisters, and then in a healthy community, both, right? But if you're coming into a marriage as a wounded person with your shields up, and you're married to a person who I promise you is equally as shielded, then you want intimacy, but you're also unwilling to be naked and unashamed. Well, you'll try, but you are ashamed. That's the problem. So
Yeah.
you kind of try, and it doesn't go well. So you double down on your shields, and you callous yourself, and you get cold, you get defensive, you get distant, and it takes a lot to overcome all of that. But marriage doesn't overcome it. It just creates the context where it can be overcome, in my opinion, at least in our day and age. And
I think that's
I,
accurate. Yeah. Well,
I
and it's
think
good.
community has always been the place where this can happen. And so, really, what I think every human needs to ask themselves is, what are the attributes of a community that I need? And then find one. I love what we've created, but it's not the only one. I mean, there's lots of great communities out there. So any place people will see you without shaming you, so that you can look at your own wounds and have people help you in your healing process, which healing isn't, that's not becoming somebody you're not. It's, I like the word remembering. It's actually, it's remembering who you always have been and addressing all of the beliefs you have about yourself that have wounded you, which are all beliefs that something is bad about you. So if you can go to a community that's going to remind you that you're not, that you're broken and unworthy, but that you're whole and you always have been whole, I think that's tremendously positive. So that's the kind of community we've created, and hopefully we'll spawn more of in the world.
I
And
hope so.
yeah,
I mean, I think it's it's a great feeling, and it's a great shift to be able to be like, you know what? I just like showing up as a warm, kind, loving, open
yeah, yeah.
individual. I
Wait till you
like
see.
that.
Wait till you see what this does in your business. This goes way beyond marriage. You know, once you kind of crack that nut in your life, as much as you're willing to be that guy, um, some really crazy stuff starts to happen, because remember, people are yearning to find acceptance.
Yeah.
So when you're no longer in consumer mode, where you're out there trying to extract from the world this feeling, but you say like, hey, I'm tapped into that. I can I can get infinitely what I need. I don't need anything from you. That is the greatest feeling. But people are like, they just seem to know, um, in a strange way. So it's very inviting energy to be
Yeah.
around, not
It
just
is.
to your
I would.
spouse.
That's such a good way to describe that. The invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying like what most men want, you know, it, and yeah, on the surface, I think many, the immature messaging is that, well, it's sex, but it's not. They want the invitation to that level of being seen in intimacy that is not that easy to come by. Um, and it feels great. And I think what's interesting when you're going through this crucible in marriage is that you do get it. Like, there was intimacy that I got from men in the community being seen. And it's not the same that you're getting from your spouse, but it all hits the same spot inside of you.
It does, but one thing I would add to that is there's no amount of information or even intimacy that shortens a cocoon cycle to 2 days, right? This is one of the biggest lies we have to overcome, is that I can go from bondage to freedom without this liminal space, this cocoon space in between. And yet that's the message culture is always trying to sell us. It's always trying to sell us this idea that you can go from stage one to stage three without the middle. And you just won't find that. There's no human transformation story where people are instantly transformed. And if it did exist, you wouldn't actually read or watch it, because it would be boring. That would be like Frodo sets out to take the ring to Mount Doom, has a pretty uneventful adventure there, throws the ring in Mount Doom, the end, right? Like, that's just not a story, right? So we have
the other one is that you all go, you're empty, you're not whole, you're not complete. Go find a lover, and you're boom done. Like you found
happily
it.
ever after. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
not the case.
That's what we're told, though, right? Like, and I think for good reason, because if you're looking for that, you're the easiest person in the world to sell something to. You'll buy every product and service in that to avoid your cocoon stage, because that is death, right? But
yeah, imagine an online dating service that went through the process to match people, like that somehow had some version of like teaching what we teach.
Yeah. I've joked around a number of times with some men in our community, but also some of my own coaches and mentors. Like, we would probably have the world's best dating service from a woman's point of view. Like, hey, these guys all graduated this process. They're emotionally safe.
Actually, like they got their certificate in not being a dick.
Yeah, that would probably be pretty appealing. And I think women who know our message would generally validate that idea and say, yeah, that would be. But I mean, we say that, and it's kind of funny to think about. But here's what I would say to a lady listening who says, yeah, that'd be awesome, is a man who's done that work is also going to want to be with a woman who's ready to go through that process herself. So, and the converse is true, because a lot of guys think, if I could just go out and find my perfect woman, everything be all right. And I always say, well, if you found such a woman, she's not going to want to be with you because you haven't experienced transformation. So why is a person who's gone through transformation going to want to partner up with somebody who hasn't?
Well, I mean, and that was something that has been discussed in terms of like, oh, well, why are you continuing on in this marriage, this challenge, blah, 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 blah. And it's because I have had throughout this process zero interest in another woman or the grass is always greener, because I inherently knew myself, like, it's just going to bubble up again because there's something with it. So like, yeah, no, she's the one I want. Like, that's my
not
choice.
The story for a lot of us. I did not have that story, and I don't say that. I mean, I feel awesome about my wife now, but I went through a lot of like grass is greener stages in my journey, and I tend to talk to a lot of men who have.
Well, I mean, there were certainly, you could have the fleeting thoughts of, and I would say it was more prior to starting to do the work. There was always the idea like, oh, well, there could just be this woman that just loved me and made life easier. But there was always, during this time of doing this work, knowing like, it doesn't, that's not the goal. Like, if you were to end this and go and do like it, you would 100% have the same problem again, because you got to figure this out, and I want to figure this out with this person that I'm with, because that's the person that I love. So,
yeah, if you can, right? Again, become a monarch first, and then see what happens.
Yeah.
So, hey, thanks for bringing this topic up. This was fun. I'm curious to see how that lands for people. I'm excited about it in conjunction with releasing the Unchained Husband shortly, because I think it covers a lot of this ground.
Yeah, I hope we got there. It started a little slow, I think, but that's what happens with these non-scripted conversations, but that's okay.
That's real life, right?
Yeah.
That works for me. All right. Thanks for being on, brother. And
thank you.
Looking forward to hearing the next chapter for you with all of this. Be exciting.
Yeah, me too.
All right. We'll see you. Thanks for tuning in to the Masterful Man podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to break free from stuckness, build unshakable confidence, and lead your life with unstoppable purpose, I invite you to take the next step. Join a community of men who are committed to growth, challenge, and real transformation. Learn more at www.masterful.men, because the life you want starts with the man you choose to become.